It was a warm autumn day, and the Fairway Grocery supermarket was buzzing with shoppers. Lorraine Hudson, a poised black woman with sleek chestnut hair and an air of confidence, entered the store to pick up groceries for her family dinner. Her husband, U.S. Army General Samuel Hudson, was finally coming home from a long deployment, and she wanted to welcome him with the warmth of a home-cooked meal. Lorraine always carried herself with grace. Her stylish cream-colored blouse and neatly pressed jeans made her stand out in the crowd. Holding a shopping list in her hand, she carefully checked off items: milk for cappuccinos, fresh vegetables, and a box of her favorite dark chocolate, her usual grocery staples. On the other side of the store, Officer Mike Stanton was patrolling, a white cop with a buzz cut and sharp, calculating eyes. Mike was known for his tough demeanor and a tendency to be overly suspicious. Though not on duty officially, he often kept an eye out for trouble, even during his off hours. As Lorraine calmly filled her shopping bag, Mike noticed her. In a mostly white neighborhood, she stood out, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her large shopping bag drew his attention, and his instincts, though biased, kicked in. Deciding she was worth investigating, he followed her. As Lorraine headed to the checkout lane, Mike stepped in front of her, blocking her path. His voice was sharp and commanding. "Hold on a second. Let me see your receipt." Lorraine stopped in her tracks, her face a mix of surprise and irritation. She had faced situations like this before, where her skin color alone seemed to spark unwarranted suspicion, but each time it felt no less demeaning. Raising an eyebrow, she calmly replied, "Excuse me? Are you talking to me?" "Yeah, you," Mike replied, crossing his arms as his gaze fell on her bag. "That's a lot of groceries for one trip. It looks suspicious." Taking a deep breath, Lorraine tried to keep her composure. "Are you serious? These are just regular groceries. And in case it wasn't clear, I've paid for everything." Mike remained unmoved. His posture and tone made it clear he had already made up his mind. "We've had reports of theft in this area. If you don't want me to call for backup, just show me the receipt." A small crowd began to gather nearby, their murmurs growing louder as they watched the confrontation. One elderly woman peeked over her glasses, while a younger man subtly started recording the scene on his phone. Lorraine scanned the faces in the crowd but saw no one she recognized. She knew that no one was likely to intervene. People always watched from the sidelines but rarely stepped forward. Tightening her grip on her bag, she started to reach for her receipt, but Mike suddenly leaned in and grabbed the bag from her hands. Her voice rose, full of righteous indignation. "Let go of my bag. You have no right to take my belongings." But Mike was relentless. His actions grew more aggressive as though he wanted to prove his point at any cost. The tension in the air was palpable, and the onlookers whispered among themselves. Lorraine glared at him, her eyes burning with both fury and dignity. "You don't even know who you're dealing with," she said, her voice steady but laced with warning. Mike Stanton, ignoring Lorraine's protests, yanked the bag from her hands. His actions were rough, almost as if he wanted to assert his authority in front of the growing crowd. A few items slipped from the bag, tumbling onto the floor, but Mike paid no attention. "What do you think you're doing? That's my personal property." Lorraine's voice grew louder, filled with righteous anger. The crowd around them hushed, their whispers rising in intensity as more people began to take notice of the scene. A few shoppers exchanged uneasy glances, and one young man with his phone already recording muttered, "This doesn't look right at all." Mike's face remained stoic, his grip on the bag firm. "I'll be the judge of what's right and wrong here," he replied curtly, unzipping the bag to rummage through it. "Sir, this is unacceptable," Lorraine protested. Her tone carried the weight of someone who had endured far too many moments of unjust scrutiny. "You're overstepping every boundary. Give me back my bag immediately." But Mike ignored her. To him, she was just another person who might be trying to pull a fast one. He rifled through her bag, pulling out groceries one by one. "Let's see what we've got here," he muttered under his breath, as if trying to justify his actions. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A middle-aged man stepped forward slightly and called out, "Hey, officer, leave her alone. She didn't do anything wrong." Mike barely glanced at him, his focus locked on proving a point he couldn't yet articulate. As his search continued, he grabbed the bag by one of its thin plastic handles and tugged it with unnecessary force. And then, it happened. With a loud snap, the flimsy plastic handle tore under the pressure, The bag ripped open, and its contents spilled onto the floor. A large carton of milk was the first to hit, landing with a splat before bursting open. A white geyser of milk erupted from the carton, spraying Mike from head to toe. His uniform quickly became soaked, the milk dripping from his face and shoulders. For a brief moment, the entire scene froze in stunned silence. Then the crowd burst into laughter. People couldn't contain themselves. Someone even clapped mockingly. "Serves him right," a woman chuckled from the back. Mike, drenched and humiliated, tried to wipe his face with his sleeve, only making the mess worse. His expression wavered between shock and anger as he turned to Lorraine, whose eyes now glimmered with a mix of indignation and quiet satisfaction. "Well, officer," she said coolly, her voice cutting through the laughter, "are you happy now? Was this what you were hoping to find?" Mike stammered, his composure slipping. This proves nothing." "No," Lorraine replied, her tone calm but piercing. "It proves everything." The crowd's laughter intensified, and even those who hadn't been watching earlier were now drawn to the commotion. Mike's attempts to salvage his dignity only made the situation worse. Milk continued to drip from his uniform onto the floor, creating a messy, humiliating puddle. Finally, someone from the crowd shouted, "She's obviously done nothing wrong. Why don't you apologize and move on?" Mike's face burned red, but he couldn't find the words to respond. Lorraine straightened her back, standing tall, as she looked at him with a gaze that radiated both strength and disappointment. "You judged me before you even knew me," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "You judged me because of how I look, and now everyone here can see exactly what that kind of judgment leads to." Mike stood frozen, drenched in milk, his hands trembling slightly as he held the torn remnants of the bag. The laughter and murmurs from the crowd only amplified his humiliation. He tried to regain his composure, but every word that left his mouth sounded weaker than the last. "Look," he stammered, "this was just a misunderstanding." Lorraine, unshaken, stepped closer. Her voice was steady, yet carried a sharp edge. "A misunderstanding? You snatched my bag, humiliated me in front of all these people, and violated my dignity. This isn't a misunderstanding, officer. This is a choice you made." The crowd murmured in agreement. A man in a baseball cap shouted, "She's right. You owe her an apology." But before Mike could respond, a calm yet commanding voice cut through the commotion. "Lorraine, is everything all right here?" The crowd parted, and a tall, dignified black man in a sharply pressed military uniform stepped forward. His presence immediately silenced the murmurs. The medals on his chest reflected the fluorescent lights, and the insignia on his shoulders left no doubt about his rank. This was General Samuel Hudson, Lorraine's husband. Lorraine's expression softened when she saw him. "Samuel," she said with a mix of relief and quiet confidence, "I'm fine now. But this officer decided I looked suspicious enough to detain and humiliate me in front of everyone." General Hudson's eyes narrowed as he turned to Mike. The officer, realizing who stood before him, stiffened. His posture was an awkward blend of shame and fear. "Is that so?" Hudson said evenly, his deep voice carrying the weight of authority. He stepped closer to Mike, his gaze steady and piercing. "Officer, do you have a valid explanation for treating my wife this way?" Mike opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face flushed as he struggled to form a coherent response. I didn't know she was your wife," he finally stammered, his voice barely audible. Hudson raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of disbelief and controlled anger. "And why exactly should that matter?" he asked sharply. "Would her being someone else's wife make your actions acceptable?" The crowd, which had grown quiet during Hudson's approach, now began to murmur again. Some people nodded, while others muttered words of agreement. I was just doing my job," Mike said weakly, avoiding Hudson's gaze. "Your job?" Hudson's voice grew firmer. He gestured toward the milk-soaked floor. "Does your job require you to humiliate innocent shoppers based on nothing more than your own assumptions? Does it require you to violate their dignity in public?" Mike's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He had no answer. Hudson took another step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over the officer. "Let me be very clear, Officer Stanton. You've not only disrespected my wife, but you've also disrespected the very values you swore to uphold when you put on that uniform. You've shown everyone here exactly how bias and poor judgment erode trust in law enforcement." The general turned to the crowd, addressing them directly. "This incident is more than just an insult to my wife. It's a reminder of what happens when we let prejudice guide our actions. It affects us all, and today, we're standing against it." The crowd erupted into applause. People clapped and cheered, some even calling out, "Thank you, General." About time someone said it. Mike shrank under the weight of the moment. He tried once more to salvage the situation. I didn't mean, I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the applause. Lorraine, who had been silent during her husband's speech, now stepped forward. Her calm composure had returned, and she addressed Mike directly. "Officer, I don't need your apology. What I need is for you to think about what you've done here today. Think about how your actions impact others and what it means to wield authority responsibly." Her words hung in the air like a verdict. Mike, realizing there was nothing more he could say, looked down at the floor, the puddle of milk beneath his feet reflecting his disgrace. Hudson turned to Lorraine, his expression softening. "Ready to go, dear?" he asked gently. She nodded. Taking his arm, the two of them began walking toward the exit. The crowd parted respectfully, many applauding them as they left. Behind them, Mike stood in silence, the laughter and applause of the crowd echoing in his ears. The phones that had recorded every second of his humiliation would soon ensure the world saw his actions, and the consequences would follow. The echoes of applause followed Lorraine and General Hudson as they exited the store, leaving Mike Stanton standing in the middle of the mess he had created, milk pooling around his feet and humiliation etched across his face. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but many people lingered, still whispering about what they had witnessed. Phones were lowered, but not before dozens of videos of the incident had been captured, ready to spread across social media. Mike stood there, frozen, his face pale, and his uniform soaked. The weight of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. The authority he had tried to wield so carelessly had slipped from his grasp, leaving him powerless and exposed. The laughter and judgment of the crowd stung more deeply than the milk soaking through his uniform. By the next morning, the videos had gone viral. Headlines like "Officer humiliates shopper, gets instant karma, and General defends wife from unjust accusation" spread like wildfire. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. People called for an investigation into Mike's actions, demanding accountability for his behavior. The police department, scrambling to manage the growing backlash, issued a public apology to Lorraine Hudson. The statement read, "We regret the inappropriate actions of Officer Stanton during an incident that took place at Fairway Groceries. His behavior does not align with the values of fairness and respect that our department upholds. The matter is under internal review." Mike was placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. As his actions were scrutinized, more questions arose about the systemic biases that allowed such behavior to persist. Lorraine's poised yet firm response during the incident became a focal point of admiration, with many praising her grace and strength in standing up against unjust treatment. That evening, Lorraine and General Hudson sat at their dinner table, the warmth of the moment a stark contrast to the earlier tension. Candles flickered softly, and the aroma of the meal Lorraine had prepared filled the room. Samuel, dressed casually now, raised his glass toward her. "To you," he said, his voice filled with pride, "for showing the world what dignity and strength look like." Lorraine smiled, clinking her glass against his. "And to you, for always having my back," she replied. She took a sip and set the glass down, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said, "this isn't just about me. This is about how often people are judged without reason, how often we're seen as something less than we are." Samuel nodded, his face serious. "You handled it better than most people could. That officer, he'll have to face the consequences, but what matters is the example you set. You reminded everyone watching that we're more than the assumptions made about us." Lorraine reached across the table, taking his hand, "And you reminded them that there are people willing to stand up for what's right. Together, we did that." The incident became a talking point in national conversations about fairness and accountability. Lorraine, though she didn't seek the spotlight, received countless messages of support from people inspired by her composure and resilience. Community leaders cited her as a role model, and discussions about the importance of addressing implicit bias gained momentum. As for Mike Stanton, he faced disciplinary action, including mandatory training on bias awareness and professional conduct. Though his career wasn't over, the incident served as a harsh lesson about the consequences of his actions. Lorraine and Samuel, meanwhile, moved forward with their lives. They knew that this moment, as impactful as it was just one step in a much larger journey toward justice and understanding. Later that night, as the couple relaxed in their living room, Samuel glanced at his phone and chuckled softly. "What is it?" Lorraine asked, looking up from her book. He turned the screen toward her. It was one of the viral videos from the store, showing Mike soaked in milk, his expression a mix of shock and regret. Lorraine laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Poetic, isn't it?" He poured out his assumptions, and the milk poured back on him. Samuel grinned, his arm resting around her shoulders. "Justice comes in many forms," he said. Together, they sat in peaceful silence, knowing they had made a difference, not just for themselves, but for everyone watching.